Hello everyone, welcome to another chapters for biology. Today we will talk about chapter 8, which is photosynthesis. We will first talk about what is photosynthesis and the overview of the entire reactions. Then we will explore the light-dependent reactions. Then we will talk about the light-independent reactions, or we can also call it the Calvin cycles. First, I want to talk about that all the metabolic processes in the organisms requires energy. As we talked about in cellular respirations, we need to break down sugar in order to extract ATP by first extracting NADH and FADH2 in order to get the energy we need to power all of our reaction inside our body. And all of that, the sugar, the energy actually trace back to photosynthesis. They are the ones that are capturing the light energy and convert it into chemical compounds in the forms of carbohydrate or sugar that we eventually consume in order to power our own metabolic activity. So essentially, all life on Earth actually depends on photosynthesis. They are the gateway of capturing that sunlight and give the rest of us the ability to grab that compound that they produce and produce our own energy. So this here is just a picture showing the distribution of photosynthetic activity by the use of a pigment called chlorophyll A. You see what that is in a little bit. And as you can see on the landmass, there will be a lot of activity, and there's also some in the ocean as well from algae, but not as much. The closer to the land, we see there's more. Alright, so let's first start with 8.1, the overview of photosynthesis. Before talking about photosynthesis, we have talked about the kind of organisms that either produce glucose from sunlight, or the kind that will consume glucose from other organisms that made it before. So we have three kind of classifications of organisms based on its production of glucose or its consumption of glucose. So the first one is photoautotrope. So photoautotrophs are the organisms that are actually making their own sugar or their own organic compounds from sunlight. So these are the ones that we will talk mostly about today. Those are plants, they're algae. They're also a bacteria called cyanobacteria, which are responsible for a lot of the first oxygens and photosynthetic compound which are captured from the sunlight. Then we have heterotrophs, which are organisms that has to consume organic substances or other organisms for food. So for example, that would include animals, fungi, and most of the bacteria that we have on the earth. And for the animals, that would consider for anyone that either are a plant eater or meat eater, as long as they're consuming other organisms, whether that a plant or another animal, they are considered heterotroph. Hetero here to mean like different. They're getting their organic compound from a different source than sunlight. Then lastly, we have the third class called the chemoautotrophs, which are organisms that can build their organic molecules by extracting energy from inorganic chemicals. So these can be sulfur, these can be like heavy metals that you often found in deep sea vent. So you can see here, this is a deep sea vent. These are the thermophilic bacteria, which thermal mean heat, less heat-loving bacteria that lives near these really hot deep sea vent deep in the ocean. So these actually, there's no oxygen here. The sunlight would not reach here. These are the actual light that they shine on these columns of smoke. So normally they don't have access to sunlight or oxygen, so they have to resort to other inorganic compounds to make their own organic molecules. So these ABCs are photosynthetic organisms. So this is a plant, this is an algae, and this is the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, they are they are not a plant, they are a bacteria. So don't confuse them with a plant. So we want to talk about the summary of photosynthesis for a little bit. Photosynthesis is a multi-step process where a variety of steps actually occur in order to convert carbon dioxide in combinations with water to make sugar and oxygens with the input of sunlight. So they use sunlight as a source of energy that driving this entire process. This is almost like the opposite of cellular respiration, where we use sugar and oxygens to make energy and give off carbon dioxide and water. So our energy is stored in the form of ATP or NADPH. No, it would be NADH and FADH. NADPH is actually for plant, which we'll talk about soon. So plant has pigment that can absorb sunlight, a very specific wavelength of sunlight, and carbon dioxide is everywhere in the air, as well as water vapor, and trees also get the water from the aquifer or the water reserve underneath the earth, underneath the surface as well. So they grab water from here, they get carbon dioxide, and with the help of sunlight they can make sugar, and they give off oxygen as a byproduct. It is a quite simple equations, however it is a much more complex process than it actually looked like. We want to then talk about a little bit about the chloroplast, which is where photosynthesis occurs. So just a little bit from the very macroscopic views down to the more microscopic view. So we have our leaves, which we know that's where photosynthesis occurs. Within the leaf, there's a cells called mesophyll cells, which are the main photosynthetic cells within a leaves, and within that we have a chloroplast. So chloroplast is an organelles, as what we talked about in chapter 4 for cell structures. So within a leaf, there's a mesophyll cells. These are cells that has a lot of chlorophyll within them. And the leaf also have a structure called a stomata. A stomata would be located underneath the leaves, which is the side that is not directly facing the sun, and they regulate gas exchange. So they allow for water to evaporate, so water can actually be transported against gravity from the lower part of the tree to all the way to the top, and they also allow for carbon dioxide to come in. So in the leaf structure, we have these two that are important. Then within our cells, we have chloroplast, of course. So chloroplast is an organelles where photosynthesis occurs. It is almost like a mitochondria. However, plants also have mitochondria, just a reminder. So it has a double membrane envelope, so it's very similar to a mitochondria, an inner membrane and an outer membrane. And they are thought to be derived from the cyanobacteria that we saw in the previous slide. However, it sort of has also a third membrane when we see the structure here, because within a chloroplast there's a lot of thylakoid, which are these disc-shaped membrane-bound structures. So sort of you can think of this outer membrane as the first membrane, the inner membrane as the second membrane, and the membrane of this thylakoid would be the third membrane within this particular organelle. So mitochondria only have an outer and an inner membrane, which are very similar to chloroplast, but in chloroplast we have an inner structures called a thylakoid that has its own membrane as well. So all these thylakoid are stacked together, and the whole stack we call them granum, or in a plural forms, grana. And the space inside that thylakoid, we call that a thylakoid lumen. Lumen is just a term for a space within something. This is where the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis actually occurs. As you will see, there's two parts of photosynthesis. The first part will actually requires the input of light, and they actually occur here in the thylakoid. And within thylakoid, they have a photosynthetic pigments which make them green. So these absorb light and reflect back green light. So we see thylakoid or mesophils or eventually leaves appear as green because they do not absorb that color. They transmit and reflect green wavelength so that we see it as green. Then the last structure that we didn't talk about yet is the stroma. Stroma is these spaces right here between the inner membrane and the membrane of the thylakoid. You have these spaces. It is liquid fill surrounding the granum, and we call that a stroma. These are aqueous fluid. So, as it just mentions, photosynthesis actually takes place in two sequential stages. The first stage, we call that the light-dependent reactions, where you require an input of light to actually drive the reaction to occur. And this is the again the granum, and these are the thylakoid stack. Which form that granums. And the second step, we call that the light-independent reactions, which do not directly requires the input of light for it to occur. However, they do need the product from the light-dependent reactions in order to occur. So in a way, they are indirectly requiring light, but the reaction itself do not have light take part within the reactions. Another name for the light-independent reactions is the Calvin cycle. Within the first light-dependent reactions, we use water and sunlight, and in order to make ATP and NADPH. So this looks very similar to NADH from cellular respirations. However, you can think this P as plant. That's for you to easy to remember and distinguish between NADH, which is for cellular respiration, and NADPH, which is for photosynthesis. So you make ATP and NADPH. So take that light energy and convert them to chemical energy, which are stored into the bonds of these electron. This is an electron carrier, while this is an actual energy. We talked about ATP before. Then, within the light-independent reactions, you actually take that CO2 coming from the stomata to enter the Calvin cycle and give off one Ga3P, which is an organic molecule. It is a sugar precursor. You will take two of this in order to make one glucose molecule. And so just to reiterate, light-dependent reaction directly requiring light, while light-independent reaction do not directly require light, but they do need that product from the light-dependent reactions. That's conclude our 8.1. See you in 8.2.